Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening to everybody. So my name is Dr. Tisetso John Rantlo. I am the Northwest representative at the ELA ESCO meeting. So tonight, my work, it's very simple, it's very brief. I just want to welcome everybody to the annual conference of the Environmental Law Association of this year. And the theme for this year is celebrating 25 years of the 1996 South African environmental right. So tonight, before we start, I just quickly wanna do the housekeeping rules. So please remember that the meeting is recorded. And secondly, please keep the mic and the camera off if you are not speaking to avoid disruptions. And in the event where you are speaking, can you please kindly switch on your camera? And then lastly, please, as the discussions are proceeding, feel free to post questions and comments on the chat box. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me the greatest pleasure to hand over to the ELA chairperson, Advocate Peter Kantor. Peter, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you very much, John. Welcome, everyone. This is the opening session of this year's annual conference, which will run during limited slots tomorrow, Friday, and Saturday. Not all day, but look at the program. It's for a few hours a day. You can use the same Zoom link to join that you used today. And a copy of the conference program and more information is on our website. This year, over 300 people have registered, and I really look forward to a wonderful conference. There's some great papers awaiting us. Our student conference finished yesterday. It took place on Monday and Tuesday, and I attended most of the sessions. It was very interesting indeed. So well done to our students and organizers. Thank you. I'd like to give a big thanks to Juta for being our conference sponsor. And thanks also to those who made donations when registering, and also for donating prizes. The theme for this year's conference is celebrating 25 years of the 1996 South African environmental right. I'm excited by the look of the presentations, which cover a broad spectrum of themes. There is much to celebrate, but this is certainly no time for complacency. We have two outstanding speakers for you in this opening session, who will be introduced by my Vice Chair, Professor Melanie Murcott. And it's my pleasure then to welcome you to the ELA conference through 2021, and I declare the proceedings open. Thanks, Melanie, over to you.
Thanks, Peter, and good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to see so many of you here with us, and we're very excited to be in this conference on 25 years of the environmental right. Our two speakers that will open the conference for us are Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, who's a senior advocate of the High Court of South Africa. He practices in the areas of human rights, constitutional law, and land. He's also the author of two best-selling books on history, constitutionalism, and land. His recent book, published by Penguin Random House, is Land Matters: South Africa's Failed Land Reforms and the Road Ahead. A copy of this book will be awarded as a prize at the end of today's proceedings to one of our members. And Advocate Ngcukaitobi will be speaking today on contested histories, land, mining, and the environment. We also have with us Professor Tracy-Lynn Field, who's an advocate and professor in the Mandela Institute of the Wits School of Law. Tracy has published extensively and influentially in the fields of environmental law, human rights law, mining law, climate change law, water law, and the extractive industry, among others. In a postgraduate course on sustainable development and environmental law at Wits in 2012, Tracy introduced me to the concept of environmental justice and sparked what's since become a huge passion for environmental law. it's a real privilege to be able to introduce her in this context some years later. Tracy is currently the Claude Leon Chair in Earth Justice and Stewardship, which is part of the interdisciplinary and cutting-edge Claude Leon Water Stewardship Program. She will be speaking on the right to environment and the transformative constitutionalism debate, the potential of direct democracy. I now hand over to Tembeka, who we're very much looking forward to. Thank you.
Many thanks, Melanie, and I'm very grateful that your association has invited me to celebrate with you the 25 years of our Constitution, which, as you have pointed out, embraces, among others, Section 24 on the right to environment. I'm also happy to note that there are a couple of students in attendance. It is always a pleasure to speak in their presence, to challenge them and perhaps to be challenged by them. My talk is Land, Mining and the Environment, Contested Histories. Excavating the histories of the colonial encounter is an exercise which continues to reveal unpredictable insights about the lives of our ancestors and their European enemies. Disruption and violence characterized this encounter. Invading European settlers took the land that Africans lived on, and by depriving them of their livestock, they forced local people to become wage laborers in the mines and farms, which Europeans had now seized ownership. Yet, as colonialism mutated into imperialism, it assumed a totalizing form, transforming the cultures, languages, religions of entire peoples. South Africa then, with its apartheid pathologies, became a typical case of colonialism, transmogrifying into imperialism. While the promise of colonialism was civilization of people with brown skins and flat noses everywhere on the planet, its reality was the violence, the killing of native people of Africa and their animals, the theft of their land and minerals, and the destruction of their habitat, their environment. The West professed its religion, but its motive was the economic profit. I should start with Connecticut in the United States of America. In 1809, George Reed and his brother-in-law, Phineas Pratt, started a comb business in the Deep River section of Potapong. Within 20 years, they began manufacturing piano keys. Deep River would soon become the leading piano maker in the world. Together with their comb making factory, they would dominate the economy of Connecticut, selling stocks to shareholders keen to profit on the boom of the period. By 1881, the firm Pratt, Reed and Company had become the leading manufacturer of pianos in the world. Combs and piano keys were made from ivory. One task would provide ivory for 45 keyboards. American and European traders preferred East African ivory for piano. But as the competition for East African ivory increased, they also looked at Egypt, the Cape, and Angola. And it is to the Cape that I want to turn. When the Dutch and British settlers arrived at the Cape, they found local people fond of hunting wild animals. But hunting was regulated by customary laws. In terms of customary laws, Africans hunted predators in order to protect their heads. They hunted antelope and small mammals to eat, and others like baboon, which scavenged their crops. But there are a few records of large-scale hunting. There is one instance associated with the king of the Zulu, Shaka. In around 1819, the area surrounding the settlement of the kingdom had to be cleared off for homesteads and to fend off tsetse flies. In 1819, Shaka himself would participate in a large animal hunt as per Zulu custom. His regiments would drive animals towards the Mfolozi River. The game would be driven on its back. It would be hamstrung and killed. Rhinoceros and buffaloes were killed. The eland, giraffe, zebra, waterbuck, and impala were trapped and speared. There were some human fatalities, but large quantities of meat were subsequently consumed. There were other reasons, of course, for the hunting of animals by Africans. Chiefs, for instance, would wear blue crane feathers, ivory bangles, lion teeth, and leopard skin. In the 1840s, the king of the Mbondo, Faku, is recorded to have made overtures to the British government through the missionaries to protect his kingdom against the Boers by instructing one of his counselors to hunt elephants and present ivory to the British. Once they had enough for the tribute, Mbondo custom was that no further killings of the animals were allowed. Many ivory tusks were collected and presented to the British. The British, however, were unsatisfied, always seeking for more. And hence, today, there is oral tradition in Pondoland that Christianity came to Pondoland in an elephant tusk. With colonization, there was a shift to industrialization. Large hunts had been confined to identified social and cultural activities centered around the kingdoms. But with European settlement, this became commercialized. With commercialization, customary laws incompatible with large-scale forms of hunting were marginalized. New methods of killing animals were devised. The most striking feature in these new methods of killing was the use of guns. The Xhosa and the Zulu societies, which previously used spears and physical hamstringing of animals, which produced very few dead animals, would now turn over. Europeans introduced rifles. The Cape would lead the way in the 1830s. Now, unlike before, most of the damage to the animals was done by the muzzle loaders before the introduction of breech-loading rifles and revolvers in the 1870s. Hunting also became part of Afrikaner culture. This was all part of the law. Wild animals had no legal protection, being largely treated by the European settlers as free goods that were not without an owner. In the wild, fueled by Darwinist theories, there was no law. Yet Africans found this attitude strange, as their own laws tended to associate wild animals with spirituality and culture. It would have been illegal, for instance, in African law to kill certain animals without the permission of a chief, which was not always granted. We also know from A.C. Jordan's masterpiece, Ingqumbo Yeminyanya, translated into English as The Wrath of the Ancestors, that the killing of a particular type of a snake was punishable under customary law. The differences in cultures are also evident from the fact that among the immigrant Afrikaner population, hunting wild animals was seen as a mechanism to create fellowship, camaraderie, and the unity among them. Paul Kruger, president of the Transvaal, would later write that every Boer took an active part in hunting, and the rising youth did a great deal in this way to make the country habitable. Hunting for them was a way of showing strength. Kruger, after whom the Kruger National Park is named, is reported to have killed about 30 elephants himself. With no legal constraints and economic motive, the killing of wild animals became common practice. There were connections between the killers, the traders, and the industrialists of Europe and America. R.G. Cumming published his book, 5 Years' Adventures in the Interior of South Africa in 1850. He was part of the Cape Mounted Rifles. In 1843, after helping the British on a military expedition against the Xhosa, he was in search of sport and freedom. He would finance it himself with the spoils of ivory. He made extortionate profits, selling rifles that cost less than £1 for ivory worth £30. Most of his recorded work is about what he killed. Although his writings might shock our sensibilities, Cummings was often cold about his methods. His object, he said, was not to torture the animal, but to put an end to its life and pain in the quickest manner possible. His expeditions give us an insight into the uncontrolled and uncontrollable hunt of the elephants in the Cape, but they also show the commercial benefit for European traders. The last elephants were shot in the coastal Transkei in the early 1860s. We have no way of knowing how many of these elephants that were killed in the Cape had their tusks taken on slave ships to America and Europe. But we know from surviving archives that East Africa, Egypt, the Cape, supplied vast quantities of ivory to support the piano-making factories of America. Export figures, for instance, from the Cape to Europe and America show that 1861 and 1883, between 1861 and 1883, there was a peak of 60,000 British pounds in income from the sales of ivory. Judging by the kilograms reflective of the quantity of ivory, this would imply the killing of 3,000 elephants per year, with an average of roughly 1,000. Having butchered more than 40,000 elephants, it was small wonder that the Cape elephant population had vanished by the late 1800s. So the African elephant was killed for knife handles, for combs and other ornaments. But from the mid-19th century, the greatest demand in Europe and America was for piano keys. Pianos were a symbol of middle-class wealth in British and American society. Its greatest manufacturer, Pratt, Reed and Company, were located in a town ironically named Ivoryton in Connecticut. So the story of the butcher of the African elephant for the entertainment of European middle classes is a forgotten story. What made this possible was the marginalization of African customary law and the imposition of a legal vacuum. But it shows the ways in which the British Empire destroyed not only the social world, but also the metaphysical world. African people still wonder today, what kind of people were these who could kill our totems, the crocodile, the baboon, the lion. Through these totems, African people remember we could talk to the ancestors. We could connect the physical and the metaphysical world. Not only did the colonists destroy the animals, they also destroyed their natural habitat. Mining was the most obvious way in which the natural world was destroyed. But alongside the violence was the construction of a newly imagined customary legal system, as seen from the perspective of the West, the new rulers. How was this version of customary law constructed? Let us go now to Kimberley. In 1875, a dispute arose on the diamond fields of Kimberley. It was not a dispute about diamonds, but about land. At issue was who owned the land where the diamonds were found. Whoever owned the land owned the diamonds, was the telos. A number of potential claimants presented themselves: the Afrikaners, the diamond diggers, the British, the Griqua. The Griqua claimed that their occupation gave them the entitlement to the land. Their argument was that since they fled discrimination from the Cape, the British had promised them ownership of the land. The first land court was established in 1875, known as the Land Court of the Griqualand West. Its function was to decide land claims. Andres Stockenstrom was appointed to preside in the court. He would reject the claims of the Griquas, reasoning that the Griqua were a nomadic people. The jurisdiction of their chiefs was over people, not over land. Stockenstrom's findings were much more significant than a mere refusal to approve the claim of the Griquas. He reasoned that the notion of private property was unknown among Africans. Thus, by the act of distorting the nature of ownership, Stockenstrom could deny ownership in its entirety. The same theme would return, not in Kimberley, but in Southern Rhodesia. This time, the legacy of Cecil John Rose was still felt. On 26 July 1918, the Judicial Committee of the United Kingdom's Privy Council published its ruling. The case was called Re Southern Rhodesia, endorsing the British Crown's claim over the entire land territory of Southern Rhodesia. The territory had been invaded by the British South Africa Company, Cecil John Rhodes, by a combination of trickery and violence. A puppet government was set up which ruled the country for 30 years. When the white settler population of Southern Rhodesia agitated for self-rule, it seized all the land and declared that they belonged to the company, and the indigenous people had no rights at all. At the Privy Council, the arguments raised by the native people were dismissed. This is its ruling. Some tribes are so low in the scale of social organization that their usages and conceptions of rights and duties are not to be reconciled with the institutions of the legal ideas of a civilized society. The backstory to the claims were concessions over land and minerals purported to have been signed between Rhodes and King Lobengula of the Ndebelés, the indigenous people of Southern Rhodesia, in 1888. The nature of the agreement, in reality, a mark of X, was dubious from the outset, but its existence was not in dispute. Lobengula had been tricked into believing that only a few whites would survey Ndebele land, and then strictly under the laws of Ndebelés. Again, the laws of the Ndebelés were swept aside and replaced by the laws of the British. At the Privy Council, the Ndebelés would achieve no victory and no joy either. Lord Sumner explained, whoever now owns the unalienated lands, the natives do not. Hence, all land was the property of the Crown, with its minerals assigned to the British South Africa Company of Cecil John Rhodes. The damaging effects of mining over land were already visible in Kimberley, where the first minerals were quote unquote discovered. Take, for instance, the writings of Josiah Semos in 1891, who noted about the diamond fields that there were diseases to the people, there was damage to the soil, there was damage to the air, and there was damage to the water. He went further. Diamond diggers and civil servants alike work all day without rest. I've traveled all over the Cape Colony. I saw towns and cities, but I have never seen a city as bad as Kimberley, and its laws are also bad. He also recorded the human suffering that came from the destruction of the soil, the destruction of the air, and the destruction of the water. He said there were many different kinds of diseased people in Kimberley. One person had no feet, only the body, and jumped around like a frog. One day, when he was jumping through the streets, he saw horses approaching him. I thought that they would stop in front of him, but he just looked up, and at precisely that moment, he made a giant leap forward so that his forehead, nose, and mouth touched the ground. The apartheid state did not change these patterns of mining. It changed only the law. And thus, the fragility of communal land over the land has not improved at the end of apartheid. Mining remains at the center of continuing and continued dispossession. Recently, a story eerily reminiscent of land seizure by the Europeans occurred. An Australian mining company wanted to mine titanium in Xolobeni in the Eastern Cape. The community feared the disastrous social, economic, and ecological consequences of mining. They were, of course, right. Their own ancestors had experienced these effects. The mining the company wanted would be open cast. It would stretch over a coastal area of some 22 kilometers long and 1.5 kilometers wide. The land was owned collectively by members of the African community, but they had no title to the land. The land was held in customary rights. There were some 75 households living in what is known as Imizi, comprising more than 600 individuals living in the area. The vast majority opposed the mining. The land, they claimed, had been used and occupied by the community for generations. The land, they argued, was an important resource and was central to their livelihoods and subsistence. They used it for grazing, for cultivating their crops, and they depended on it for water and for building materials, firewood, edible and medicinal fruits and plants, fish, and shellfish. Members of the community also relied on it for tourism that occurs with the area. Because there was mining proposed, development in the area had been sterilized since at least mid-2000s. This community expressed this fear in court. This time there was a difference, a new constitution with a new Bill of Rights. They argued that it would result in a physical displacement of community members from their land or from their homes. And this would lead to economic displacement associated with the loss of assets or access to assets and resources. They argued that mining, as it had happened in Kimberley 100 years earlier, would disrupt existing social and economic linkages that bind the community together. Industrialization would lead to an increase in outsiders, placing pressure on social services, increasing squatting, crime, alcohol abuse, and other social evils. And they argued that it would likely lead to the further destruction of traditional authority structures and traditional norms and culture. It would lead, they argued ultimately, to the loss of the community's cultural identity and way of life. They should have added, it would destroy the soul of the community. These conflicts had been triggered by the fact that their chief, Inkosi Baleni, had become a director in the company that wanted to engage in mining. We are no longer in the era of the colony. The new constitution has changed the landscape. The community won its case in the High Court. The High Court concluded that where the land is held on a communal basis, the community must be placed in a position to consider the proposed deprivation from mining. It should be allowed to take a communal decision in terms of its custom, whether to consent or not to the proposal to mine. Here, the right to say no to mining was born. But it is in a later case, much more recently, that the right has cascaded from the communal to the family. And the case involves Ingonyama Trust, a progeny of the previous colonial regime, in terms of which the king was the trustee of the land. But as the trustee, he could encumber, pledge, lease, alienate, or otherwise dispose of the land. But the problem is that the king began acting as owner, no longer as trustee. He decreed that everyone living in the area should become a tenant of the king, paying a rent. And this was in addition to other commercial agreements concluded with large firms, granting them rights to excavate the land, exploit it, provided that they paid rentals to the king. And women were at the receiving end of it, the trust refusing to deal with them in the absence of their male relative. Like in the Kolobeni case, there is a promise in the judgment of the High Court. It found that according to indigenous law, the king has no ownership right over the land. Indigenous law says that the land is owned communally. And for the first time, customary law was recognized as a basis to invalidate state decision. And this is a fundamental transformation of customary law from its colonial and apartheid origin. Customary law thus can constrain government and corporate conduct. But moreover, the court held that it is not the ubiquitous community that must decide. Once a portion of the land has been allocated to a particular individual as residential or arable land, it is taken out of communal ownership. It is demarcated, it has fixed boundaries. The ownership thereof descends from generation to generation. And finally, we can now see that customary law has been fundamentally transformed. There are instances of clamor for the return of unbridled powers of the chiefs. European justification for the invasion of the newly discovered territories in the 17th and 18th century was civilization. This, however, began wearing thin. After the industrial age, progress, economic advancement became the new explanation. We now know, of course, that none of the promises of civilization and economic advancement were fulfilled. In the place of the promise, there was a pillage, and then a plunder of the land, the animals, and the people. The Constitution has been a promising start in halting profit-based private action against the people. It is perhaps most potent in its recognition of customary law as containing substantive protections. By enlarging the constitutional scope of customary law, we can expand its reach. We can offer new property protections to persons whom the law once regarded as property. We cannot, of course, restore what was lost, but we can prevent future damage. And importantly, customary law promises to place the power of economic development back in the hands of the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Tembeka. You took us on a real journey from many years ago to the present, and exposed the importance of decolonizing our law, and including in the context of environmental law. For me, one of the most significant impacts the colonial era has had on our environmental law is the othering of people and nature, or separation of people from nature. And we can learn so much from customary law about a return to the connection between people and nature. We're going to reserve time for questions at the end, but at this moment we have to turn over to Prof. Field. And so over to you, Tracy. We really look forward to hearing your talk too. Please, in the meantime, feel free to add questions for both our speakers in the comment section, and we'll engage with those questions during the discussion time. Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you so much, Melanie, and allow me to start by just expressing my pleasure at being here and amongst so many familiar names, although one can't see the faces. It's lovely to be part of this occasion, and I thank the ELA Conference Committee for entrusting me with this plenary address. So I have a presentation that I'd like to share. Are you able to see my screen? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So the title of my talk tonight is From Transformative Constitutionalism to Constitutional Transformation, Quo Vadis, Section 24. I took a little bit of liberty to change it slightly, Melanie. And it flows from my recent work on transformative constitutionalism and democratic sovereignty, which is one of the many types of sovereignty I believe we exercise in relationship to each other and nature. In my deep dive into transformative constitutionalism, I wanted to understand the character and expression of democratic sovereignty under South Africa's so-called post-sovereign model of constitution making. And this plenary address has given me an opportunity to extend that inquiry into transformative environmental constitutionalism, for which I'm grateful. So I hope that what I can offer this evening will open up new pathways for the work we can do with Section 24, our beloved 25-year-old constitutional right to environments. Okay. So I'm going to begin with a provocation. If Section 24 were standing for election, what would its manifesto be? How would it compete with the myriad other human priorities variously arranged on Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Would it take an instrumental approach, demonstrating its material importance to most other human needs or rights? Would it lobby for Earth democracy and argue for its own inclusion in the political community of equals that constitute the demos? In appealing directly to we the people, would it strenuously argue for protection of very special parts of itself? The grasslands of Nkangala Drakensberg, the Strandveld dunes of the West Coast, a certain district in Ponderland, pointing out, this is your heritage. Would it say, everywhere I am trampled on, used up, polluted, and poisoned, injustice flows? Or would it rather say, I am synonymous with work, well-being, and wealth? So my presentation today explores this relationship between democracy and Section 24, because we not only live in a constitutional order, we live in a constitutional democracy, which is an order based on we the people, based on self-rule. So now I'm going to go to some photo galleries, looking at the transformative constitutionalism debate. So the democratic self-rule stands alongside constitutionalism as one of the two fundamental legitimating principles of the constitutional order. But this seems to me to be somewhat obscured in the transformative constitutionalism debate. This debate has taken shape in recent years as confidence in the Constitution has started to wane, to the point where strong voices are arguing for its abolition, given the myriad injustices the majority of South Africa's people continue to suffer under the long shadow of colonial apartheid. It is a debate, as Joel Madiri has claimed, defined by the positions of constitutional triumph and betrayal. As triumph, transformative constitutionalism is anchored in Carl Clare's vision of an incremental unfolding and development of the Constitution's normative framework, a progressive constitutional enactment which inches a country in a more democratic, participatory, and egalitarian direction. Transformative constitutionalism is an approach to rights and rights adjudication that gives the constitutional text and not the fact of democratic self-rule center stage. It assumes that a right is given content through legislative enactment and the adjudicative work of the courts. Its master frame for social emancipation is social justice, which has a normative, substantive, and a procedural dimension. As a norm, this seems above reproach. In the words of Thuli Madonsela, it requires the equal enjoyment of all rights and freedoms, regardless of human diversity, reflected in the fair and just distribution of all opportunities, resources, benefits, privileges, and burdens in society or groups and between societies. As mechanism, however, it frequently takes the form of social movement building linked to donor-funded strategic public interest litigation. The archetypal social justice case involves an erstwhile white-dominated civil society social justice sector acting on behalf of poor, marginalized Black individuals or communities against a Black government. Often, it is through brilliant legal minds like Advocate Ngcukaitobi, advancing progressive, transformative interpretations of the constitutional text, that the people are able to speak and express their constitutional preferences, supported, of course, by brilliant scholars who've paved the way by expanding on the normative content of the constitutional text in their academic research. On the betrayal side of the debate, scholars like Joel Madiri, Saneli Sibanda, Tshepo Madlingozi, and Ndumiso Dladla argue that the Constitution is a benign second conquest that has recolonized diverse Black emancipatory struggles to put a new human being at the center of society. They argue that the constitutional democracy has been rendered empty because it has failed to secure concrete historical justice, particularly for still living perpetrators of apartheid, and because it has failed to secure material human dignity for the Black majority. Hegemonic discourses like transformative constitutionalism, human rights, and social justice maintain white supremacy and privilege through their moderate and non-threatening political posture. They argue for their abolition or radical overhaul of the constitutional order to allow for marginalized and occluded Azania-centric ideas of nationhood, law, justice, national culture, and values to emerge. Then we have transformative environmental constitutionalism, and I hope you like the photos that I chose of you all. So transformative environmental constitutionalism is aligned with the Constitution as triumph approach. It also dovetails with the broader global turn to environmental constitutionalism, superbly led by scholars like Erin Daly and James May. In transformative environmental constitutionalism, the constitutional text and the adjudicative work of the courts also assume center stage. What scholars working in this paradigm add is that the pursuit of social justice must be interconnected with the pursuit of environmental and climate justice for the poor. The arguments of the Constitution as betrayal camp do not go unacknowledged. Proponents of transformative environmental constitutionalism admit the limits of law and liberal rights discourse, but argue that judgments can be powerful political tools. As Melanie Murcott has explained, transformative environmental constitutionalism allows judges to acknowledge the material power relations of race, class, and gender that underlie South African society. It also permits the judicial diagnosis of poverty as injustice. There can be no doubt that transformative environmental constitutionalism, like those who assess the constitutional project positively, has made an indispensable contribution to establishing and legitimating the post-apartheid constitutional order. But how does this debate, whether as triumph or betrayal, square with the fact that the Constitution also established a demos, a political community of equals that ostensibly exercises democratic sovereignty, a demos of about 58 million souls, and obviously that would be more if you include the animal and insect and natural world, that is irremediably heterogeneous in its composition. In his contribution to the transformative constitutionalism debate, Feroz Kashalier has argued that the sovereignty of the demos should be restored to a central position. He maintains that neither the Constitution as triumph nor the Constitution as betrayal stance properly contends with the democratic content of the constitutional project. Rather than a text with normative content, it is the demos, the political community of equals, that is the core idea of the Constitution and the ultimate constitutive power behind it. This shifts in understanding from the Constitution as a kind of normative agent to a set of institutions that drives democratic practice or not. It is this generative proposition from Kashalier that prompted my own foray into the minefield of transformative constitutionalism. If the demos and democratic politics are central to the outworking of the Constitution, how does democratic sovereignty really work? And in particular, how does it work over time? By asking these questions, I'm contemplating something broader than questions around representative or participatory democracy, which are the rules of self-rule already inscribed in the 1996 Constitution. I am asking how the demos expresses itself to establish and hold a constitutional order together. At this point, I want to interpolate my presentation with a reality check. Just under 2 months ago, in the wake of the jailing of former President Jacob Zuma, South Africans lived through the worst public violence of the democratic era. We can debate the proximate cause of the violent protests and looting, but there can be no doubt that the socioeconomic context in our country is a volatile, dangerous, and potentially explosive powder keg. In the July 2021 uprising, looting, insurrection, whatever you would like to call it, we could truly see the precarity of our constitutional order and the fragile veneer of the state. Long simmering grievances boiled over in shocking, even apocalyptic scenes of destruction. The country seemed to be holding onto the democratic order by the skin of our teeth. These events must force us to confront the fact that the current constitutional order is not serving millions of South Africans. In particular, it is not serving what Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh has called the workless class. Some 12 million South Africans doomed to perpetual unemployment. Every quarter when Stats SA releases its quarterly labor force survey, as Stefan Grotes writes, we are shocked all over again by the rampant disappearance of jobs in our economy. Even the graduate unemployment rate, as my partner, Dr. Linda Meyer at University South Africa informs me, has now climbed to 9%. How long can this situation last before the dam breaks? And with it, our beautiful, crystalline, transformative constitutionalism castles in the air. This is an image of the burned out shell of the UPL chemical warehouse in Cornubia, north of Durban, which illustrates better than any other instance the inextricable links between socioeconomic deprivation, social discontent, and environmental destruction. As some among us are aware, the looting-related fire at this warehouse caused a massive chemical spill, which caused substances to be released into the surrounding air, water, and soil, and the environmental justice fight here has just begun. I will say more about this case later. This image, courtesy of BBC staffer Tutuka Zondi, is likely to emerge as one of the most iconic visual representations of the July 2021 unrest. It captures a 2-year-old child in freefall as her mother drops her into the outstretched arms of strangers from a building that had been set alight by looters. It is an image that begs for pause, as Marianne Tam wrote, because it depicts how the South African demos has been in freefall, dropped steadily from a great height. As editor Adrian Basson quipped, "Good people of South Africa, You are on your own. But in a system of democratic self-rule, have we not been on our own all along? Can the demos exercise its constituent power to address the critical national questions that are tearing South Africa apart? So, much depends on the institutions of self-rule. This brings me back to my earlier question. How does a demos exercise sovereignty at the moment of the founding of the constitutional order and over time? In asking these questions, I've been greatly assisted by the work of David Gruwell and Jedediah Purdy's contribution to the originalism, living constitutionalism debate in the United States. And they in turn draw on Richard Tuck's metaphor, Richard Tuck's reconstruction of the founding of modern democracies and his metaphor of the sleeping sovereign. Modern democracies, so this is like the theory part, guys. Modern democracies unite millions of people into a sovereign we the people. At the moment of the founding of the constitutional order, in the reformist and revolutionary constitutional traditions, there is a moment of popular authorship, however contrived, when the sovereign speaks with one voice, univocally, on the constitutional design rules that will institute self-government over time. Because summoning the views of the sovereign on day-to-day issues of policy, law, and justice is impractical, the sovereign then goes to sleep, allowing the government as instituted to get on with the job. The metaphor of the sleeping sovereign underscores the important distinctions between sovereignty and government, and constitutional and ordinary lawmaking. Constitutional lawmaking must allow the democratic sovereign to speak univocally on the fundamental norms and procedures that establish self-rule when the popular sovereign has gone to sleep. But securing popular authorship is not enough. Democratic sovereignty must be ongoing and self-renewing, or else fail as a practice of self-rule. The demos is constantly being renewed, and the rigor and health of a constitutional order can only be sustained if it secures their present consent. In order to secure present consent, it may therefore be necessary to reassemble, to awake the democratic sovereign, to engage in processes of constitutional lawmaking, and tweak the institutions of self-rule to the ever-changing ecological, political, social, and economic conditions of life. Where formal processes of constitutional amendment make this inordinately difficult, as is the case in the United States and arguably also in South Africa, the adaptation of a constitutional order proceeds by way of a different modality of democratic expression, not univocally, but multitudinously. Gruwell and Singh explain multitudinous constitutional lawmaking as a mode of lawmaking where citizens contest the meaning of constitutional values and terms through multiple and often opposing social movements and other forms of political mobilization. More often than not, the arbiter amongst these competing claims are the courts. The problem with multitudinous constitutional lawmaking is that it lacks the clarity and finality of a process that would allow the demos to speak univocally on critical national questions. It is thus vulnerable to charges of opportunism and self-serving interpretation. Time prevents a detailed consideration, but I do believe the deadly air case currently before the courts clearly illustrates the dangers of multitudinous and the limitations of multitudinous constitutional lawmaking. Competing mobilizations and interest groups jockey for the imprimatur of judicial authority, which may then in turn be attacked by the losing group. It should be clear that transformative constitutionalism in South Africa rests on multitudinous democratic expression as a modality for securing present consent. But that isn't all. To understand the character and expression of democratic sovereignty in South Africa, we also need to take into account the fact that ours is a model of so-called post-sovereign constitution making. So this is a theoretical model developed by constitutional law scholar Andrew Arato to describe the constitution making that emerged in the later half of the 20th century in places like Spain, some Eastern European countries, and South Africa. The post-sovereign model speaks to the problem of making constitution making meaningfully democratic in a pluralistic world. In contexts where resort to a fictional unity of we the people can dangerously override multiple overlapping lines of difference. Instead of a moment of popular authorship, post-sovereign constitution making rests on a two-stage process of an interim constitution and a final constitution with free elections in between. The interim constitution regulates and binds the second with a spectrum of control ranging from binding procedures to substantive content. As we know in South Africa, the constitutional principles set out in the interim constitution bound the final constitution substantively, with the added requirement of certification by the constitutional court. The post-sovereign model, in effect, dispenses with the idea of popular authorship. Instead, the democratic legitimacy of the process, at least as far as the interim constitution is concerned, relies on multivocal and plural civil society representation, manifesting in, for example, roundtable negotiations. So under this model, the democratic sovereign is constituted, but it stays asleep during the constitutional inauguration. What are the implications of this post-sovereign model for the exercise of democratic sovereignty over time? Henk Botha has described the kind of sovereignty exercisable in South Africa as splintered sovereignty. Instead of a unified sovereign collective author, the 1996 Constitution's reference to we the people invokes a collective constitution selfhood of first-person singulars, as he explains. In this view, the first-person plural of collective constitutional selfhood can only be thought in terms of the being together of different first-person singulars. The singular and the plural are here seen as co-originary, and both are undermined by the invocation of a community understood in terms of a shared identity or substantive sameness. What constitutionalism on this understanding must guard against is the violent reductionism through which the spaces between subjects are made to disappear. Splintered sovereignty links up with Lefort's idea of democracy as an empty space, where univocality is constantly interpolated by plurality and hence by indeterminacy and questionability. So these understandings of sovereignty and democracy raise a number of objections, but for the purposes of this presentation, I will highlight only one. Interminable indeterminacy and questioning do not seem to be a particularly successful recipe for collective action, where the socio-political and economic context is crying out for finality and decisiveness. The collective of first-person singulars may be alive and well, but as the unified sovereign dithers, hungry and workless South Africa is going up in flames. So this theoretical excursus, together with the state of constitutional amendment in South Africa, which time prohibits me from delving into, allows for a better understanding of the character and expression of democratic sovereignty in South Africa. In the democratic era, the South African demos has never spoken univocally. The last time there was ever any kind of univocal expression was the whites-only 1992 referendum, which had to decide whether the National Party government should continue with the reform process or not. And an 85% turnout, 68% vote said yes. Constitutional amendments in South Africa take the form of governmental rather than sovereign lawmaking, even though there are heightened thresholds for constitutional amendments. The constitutional amendments that we have only tinkered at the margins, and the constitutional multitude is the dominant political juridical ontology for securing present consent. And I don't think this is good enough. Coming then to the final part of my presentation. At the start, I asked, Quo Vadis Section 24, and promised new pathways for the scholarly and practical work around Section 24, and I believe there are three. The first is to continue the important work on transformative environmental constitutionalism, developing the normative content of the right, engaging with the adjudicative work of the courts, and launching public interest litigation in pursuit of social, environmental, and climate justice. But two less well-traveled paths should be also be pursued with equal vigor. So the first is what I've termed democratic sovereignty, direct democracy, and constitutional lawmaking. Under this broad banner, I include ways in which univocal constitution making could be mobilized under the present constitutional order. For example, the president's power to call a referendum on a critical national question, still using the old Referendums Act. The most obvious candidate for a critical national question, in my view, is the land question, because despite the hype about the historical approval of the 18th Constitutional Amendment Bill, this bill is dead in the water without the EFF support. But looking beyond the land question, the Referendums Act allows the president to ascertain the views of voters in any part of the republic. The role of direct democracy in natural resource disputes in particular areas, for example, is completely unexplored. In suggesting this, I am alive to the complexities of direct democracy, its advantages, limitations, and dangers, but let's at least start having the debates. Under this banner, I also include a more ambitious set of substantive proposal for the Constitution's formal amendment, including how it could be amended to allow for forms of direct democracy as a balancing to multitudinous constitutional lawmaking. I think we should permit ourselves to explore ways in which the Constitution could be improved, starting with the formulation of Section 24, and not leaving out important design features of government that are stubbornly standing in the way of securing environmental justice, environmental protection, and human rights. Top of my list here would be the decentralized system of government that gives significant powers to local government in areas where it is currently failing apocalyptically, and apologies declared. It's not the whole of local government, but just the parts where it's failing apocalyptically. Here I draw on Mpofu Walsh's insightful analysis of who won what at the multi-party negotiating process. The idea of the three-tiered system of government was a direct descendant of the National Party's constitutional rule manifesto. The importance of this win, which also produced a head-scratchingly complex list of legislative and executive functional areas, was that it would render the central governing authority weak. The devolution of authority requires that any national policy can only succeed with the tremendous levels of provincial and local coordination. As Mpofu Walsh notes, no matter the ideal to which the country aspired, reaching that ideal would need Herculean governmental orchestration across multiple levels of authority. Finally, I would also like to include the possibility of a more radical, thoroughgoing reform of the Constitution through the possibility of a new constitutional convention. Not abolition, but saving the best and fixing the worst of what the current constitutional order has to offer. We need to start thinking of the environmental sector's claims, where such a platform to be established. Finally, I believe that the environmental law community should work urgently and unceasingly on the Section 24 election manifesto. Our audience in this case is not the legal fraternity, not the bench, but the demos itself. This entails action on at least three fronts. The first would be to hone in on the areas of policy and legislative change that address environmental and socioeconomic problems simultaneously and go to the deep-seated roots of the material conditions that stoke rage, shame, envy, and greed in our country. This will entail really developing Section 24B3 of Section 24. What socioeconomic development is justifiable and ecologically sustainable? This goes far beyond pointing out the socioeconomic promise of Section 24, but aggressively putting this right to work for work, well-being, and health. I think there are fruitful avenues to investigate in energy, water, and sanitation and waste, just to start off. The second is environmental education and awareness. And I have here in mind not only in way in which environmental issues and sustainability alternatives are taught in the school curriculum, but also galvanizing free public education. The relationship between Section 24 and the right to education is completely unexplored. And finally, there is work to do in understanding how better awareness and understanding of the environmental commons can serve as the basis for political mobilization and solidarity. And having here in mind the experience of 2 weeks ago where I stood in the field at the school in Redham in Cornubia with the shell of the chemical factory in the background. And before me, representatives of Blackburn community, Izinga, Phoenix, Durban North, Mount Edgecombe, and united in this fight of the chemical injustice that occurred in that area. And it made me excited to think that we don't have to act along party political lines. We can act in defense of democracy and in defense of the environment and each other. So with these thoughts, I draw my presentation to the close. I hope it has offered you something of value and wish you a splendid conference celebrating our environmental rights 25th year.
Thank you, Tracy. I can hear the applause in my mind. What a powerful presentation taking us on such a journey. I have two questions before I open it to the floor, one for each of you. And if you wouldn't mind turning on your camera, Tembeka, at this point. Great. So I see that we are starting to get questions in the chat. Thank you, Melandri, for your question. Please keep them coming. And also feel free to raise your hand as well. So firstly, for Tembeka, I wanted to ask, how do we strengthen the role of customary law in environmental law, but in general in South Africa? We have a couple of constitutional tools that we saw used in Ngqongqoshe, but it clearly isn't enough, and that was it was just a small step. And we've also seen how free prior informed consent has been brought into our law in Maledu and Baleni. But again, there's so much more that can be done. What are your thoughts on strengthening this role of customary law, and also what are some of the risks?
I think the first problem with customary law, as you can see, the theme of what I was trying to say today is perhaps if we look at strengthening customary law, there's a supportive role that it can play in fulfilling the Section 24 rights. So that's at a substantive level. So that's the key point. Now, the one problem with customary law is the dealing with its distortions. And that is what we encounter all the time. We find textbooks that purport to record customary law, and the customary law is often in conflict with lived customary law. So I think the first thing with customary law is addressing the distortions. The second thing is to build on the powerful judgment of the KwaZulu-Natal full bench in the Ingonyama Trust case. It makes 3 points. I didn't have time to read them, but they are in my paper. But it makes 3 points. The first one is that customary law can be used to constrain governmental power. So whereas ordinarily we use paja and we use legality as a constraint to governmental power, customary law is also now a standard for the constraint. So one cannot convert, and that was the point in that case, one cannot convert a permission to occupy into a leasehold, because that conversion is a substantive breach of a customary law entitlement. So that's the second thing, is to recognize its potential as a substantive constraint on governmental power. The third thing that judgment makes clear is not only is it a constraint to governmental power, it is also a constraint to private power. Remember that one of the problems with that case was the use of leaseholds, commercial leaseholds in communal areas without community consent. So that procedural device of thinking about the community consent as a constraint to private power, which builds, and it's fascinating for me because it builds, it's a remarkable thing. I mean, when we litigated the Ngqongqoshe case, the Maledu case, the Xolobeni case, and now finally the Ingonyama Trust case, we never thought that we could be expanding the horizons of custom so that it plays the role that it is now playing. So the one finding made on private power is that a mine is not entitled merely because it possesses a right to mine. It is not entitled to walk in, as they previously did, without consent. And consent is not a ubiquitous thing that you get at the top of where the community meets. Consent is a localized thing. It's the person who lives at a umuzi who needs to consent. So I think those foundations are useful foundations. They are obviously always precarious because every victory you register in customary law is a precarious victory, constantly at the risk of rescission. So the key is to look at the next case and build upon those 3 foundations. But the 4 cases have been fascinating for me because they have shown the progressive development of the rules of custom by people who want to protect their natural environment, who say would rather do tourism than mining. And then the final point, which is not really a customary law point, but it's a general point about mining. There was a study produced by Benchmarks Foundation in the Xolobeni case. It was never referred to in the end because the case turned on the interpretation of IPILRA and MPRDA. This is what the study said. The study said the researchers had looked at 8 mining projects in the Northwest, 8. They found that in none of those mining projects has mining, in fact, been good for the community. Every time there has been a mining activity, without fail, the consequences are deadly for the community. The promises of the jobs are usually temporary and they soon dry up. The devastation in relation to water is permanent and it is never reversed. The devastation in relation to the air is usually permanent, never reversed. The diseases that the children suffer from are usually just permanent damage. So the entire argument that is usually used to justify mining, which is it's good for economic development, it's been disproved by study after study. I think the next big frontier is to make that point into a judgment, the point that mining has always produced negative consequences which far outweigh the supposed benefits. What it does do is to produce extortionate profits for the shareholders, but always damages the people that encounter it.
Thank you. That was a very powerful answer. And then for Tracy, the question that I have is, you spoke so beautifully about the three perspectives on the environmental right, from the promise and the betrayal and then the demos. And I wonder, are these perspectives not all capable of existing simultaneously and all being true simultaneously? You know, the Constitution is inherently flawed and its promise is flawed, but the promise still remains, and there also remains a crucial role for the broader South African population to play in enforcing this. And I suppose that's part of what your solutions were pointing to. And then the second part of the question is whether there's a role for the Climate Justice Charter to form part of this Section 24 manifesto. I've been reading a lot about it lately, and I've been reading it and thinking a lot about it lately, and it's a really powerful document, and I think a lot more could be made of it. And I wondered what your thoughts were.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Melanie. Yeah, sure, they can all exist simultaneously, but I think, you know, as in what realm? In the realm of scholarship and academic work, but what about the realm of actual politics? And, you know, for me, the thing that keeps me up at night is, do people still buy into the constitutional order? And how do we convince them that this is working for them? And I think there are more and more voices that are saying, you know, something needs to shift. And what this study for me did was just to show, and I'm not saying that you need direct democracy on, you know, on everything, but sometimes you need that univocal expression just to shift the debate, to bump it into the next paradigm. Just like that 1992 referendum, you know, if it wasn't for that, would we have even embarked on the post-sovereign constitution process? So I think it's almost like we're a bit unbalanced. We're so far along the spectrum of multitudinous constitutional making, and that we sometimes need a bit of majoritarianism, but we don't want the situation of Hungary, which is something I also explore in my paper, which was Andrew Arato's other poster child for post-sovereign constitution making. And Hungary has now gone down the line of increasing authoritarianism with a very flexible constitutional amendment rule. So it's like we need majoritarianism, but we need that to be tempered. So it's about the relationship between democracy, the constitution, the rule of law, and giving the people expression. So those are my thoughts there. And I do think that we need to appeal to the demos. And show that, and I loved Tembeka's comments about that there's a kind of development that just doesn't create economic wealth. So we know that protecting the environment is really good in the long run. We need to convince more people about that and do the academic work that's going to support that. On the Climate Justice Charter, absolutely. My colleague at WITS, Vishwas Sarkar, have put an incredible amount of work into that. It's intended to I didn't even know about this provision in the Constitution. I think it's section 234, which allows for charters to be adopted by parliaments. And that is what they're aiming for. But the vision of that climate justice charter with its, its alternatives is incredibly important. And I think that's a starting point. You're going to talk about environmental rights in education. That's what you want to be seeing in the schools, kids to be learning about that stuff. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it would be absolutely brilliant to have the climate justice charter in schools and in LLB degrees and everywhere else. I think that would be amazing. I'm going to ask questions from the chat. I don't see any hands. I'll start with a couple for Tembeka and then go on to a couple for Tracy. So Melandri's question, she points out that she's a resident of Kimberley and she says, I found it quite enlightening to listen to an account of the history of Kimberley that was plagued with unfair labor practices and human rights abuses. Despite Kimberley being known as the diamond capital, the discovery of diamonds really didn't do much for the development of the city in comparison to the case of Johannesburg. To get, although that's also debatable, to get to a point of reform, restitution, and most importantly, transformation, what should be the government's approach, especially when we still see these inequalities and environmental and economic injustices in present-day South Africa where mining is concerned? And then there's a question about the case law, which I think Wilhelmine, Prof. Du Plessis is helping us with. And Tefo asks, which I think probably applies to both of you, do our problems lie in the Constitution or its implementation? And what's the effect of the incapacitated state in achieving environmental justice? And then lastly for Tembeka, from Clive, Dr. Vinti, how do we deal with the legacy of Alex Core and Gongoshe that endorses the idea that legislation can extinguish indigenous law, the section 211 of the Constitution conundrum? Mike Bishop's actually published something brilliant on this recently, Clive, that you might, 2021, that might be useful. So let's start with Tembeka responding to those three questions for now, and then we'll come back to Tracy.
So thank you. Yeah, I mean, maybe let me start with the second question, which is, what's our problem? Is it the Constitution or what else? Yeah, I mean, I'm always very curious to listen to people who are saying that, the Constitution is wrong because it doesn't say what they think it should say. But I ask them, what is the provision that you would change in the Constitution? Would you say that there should be no right to life? There should be no freedom of expression? And I never get a straight answer. So often what I get is all of these generic statements, which never really touch upon what exactly is the problem. Just like the complaint about its Eurocentrism. What I usually get is a very general thing about, this is a Eurocentric document. When you try to drill down whether or not in an Afrocentric context, we wouldn't want the freedom of expression. I mean, we never really get any proper answer. So eventually we come back to where we started, which is we've got a constitution. It was negotiated in the sweat and blood of the transition, and we must make it work. And the attempt to remove section 25(2)(b) has failed, but we must make section 25 work. And so that's what occupies my life, is making the Constitution work. I hear what Tracy is saying. I'm just not particularly sure around the issue around we should be going back to the people, etc. The problem I have with this thing is that the people I see, even this week, people I saw on Monday, yesterday, and today, they say that we've got a problem because we haven't got water, but the Constitution promises us water. They say we've got a problem because we haven't got houses, but the Constitution promises us houses. That's the kind of problem that I encounter. And that's the problem I try to spend my energies resolving. It's the gap between the promise and the reality. Now, it seems to me that if we spend a lot of time theorizing about how that gap is to be met, we are much likely to get quicker to the constitutional promise. And I don't see, and that's just another point to be made on this, I just don't see this distinction that people are drawing between the people on the other hand and the people are the Constitution. That's where the Constitution lives. It lives in the soul of the people, And you see this everywhere. When they don't demand a new constitution. They demand the fulfillment of the promise of the Constitution. They go out on the streets, they bend, they barricade, but they're demanding the Constitution itself. So it seems to me that experience has taught us over and over again that the Constitution lives among the people. It is in their spirit. When they speak, they are articulating a constitutional demand. You see, Melanie, I wrote the book, The Land is Ours. In 1910, you stood outside Paul Kruger Square and you shouted equality. The guys would actually lynch you, hang you, like literally, you'd be hanged. In the same court, you'd be hanged. So equality then was a political demand. Political demand. The big change is that equality is a legally enforceable demand. It's no longer political, it's a legally enforceable demand. So what we are trying to do is work around how this equality would look like and how do we actually achieve it within the external constraints of not wanting to destroy in order to build. And that's really, for me, the key thing. Now, I've been talking about customary law today. Now, 8 years ago, when we began the first case on custom, we took the first step with Knox. It was a relatively minor and insignificant victory. But if you look back now at 5 cases that have been litigated and the continuous expansion of customary law entitlements, it is a remarkable thing that we've moved from a negative position of consultation to a positive consent, not just at a community level, but at Umuzi level, at the level of Umuzi. This is a remarkable thing. So no mind now can just walk in and say, we want to do X, etc. Now, that leaves me to this issue of the legislation. I think we need to look at the theory initially around this thing about the legislation being able to override. The theory was obviously our democratic system is representative, so everyone is in parliament and those are the people who've elected. Those people are entitled to override common law. You see, that's the point. They're entitled to override the common law by legislation. And the point that was at the time thought of is, well, if common law is at the same sort of level as customary law and they can override common law, why can they not override custom? But then there are restraints. In other words, the legislation that is passed must specifically deal with custom. Now, of course, you see, we lawyers, we try to win a case. In Ngqongqoshe, we had to win the case on the basis that there is no legislation that specifically overrides customary law. That's the point. There is no legislation that does so, and the legislation they are relying upon doesn't even mention fishing, small-scale fishing. So it cannot, so that we win the case. So we have to think about another case that will constrain the legislative ability to override custom and think about how we do that. What we know now about custom is that since the Ingonyama Trust case, it can provide a substantive attack on executive authority, executive power, on state action. Now, this is a monumental achievement. So we have to move that to the legislative space to see how to legislate consistently with custom. But there's a tension there because there is a constitutional provision that appears to provide that these guys can do this, provided they specifically deal with it. Look, I mean, then the last thing about restitution, This is the old problem, about it's the unfulfilled story of our system, right? The whites came here in big numbers, at least from 1652. And when Van Riebeeck got off that boat, he began to pillage, to plunder. He continued to do that until he was stopped by the British in 1806. But the British didn't stop him because they liked the natives. They just wanted to do it for themselves. And then they continued another 200 years of pillaging and plundering, right? And then we have this big moment in 1994 where we say, all right, we need to build this country. And one of the things that are outstanding from that moment is what is the scope of restitution. Elsewhere, I've written in my book about Germany around confronting the unresolved problem of the past. So that is what we need to build. We need to build a system in which we can talk openly and freely about restitution without creating a sense that other people are no longer welcome to participate in the discourse. We have to think seriously about the argument about reparations, but we have to channel it in constitutional language, in legal language, because we should not destroy the rule of law by the idea of restitution. So the point is to think about restitution in a way that respects the rule of law. But Melanie, I often talk about restitution. I met someone, so I wrote about this fellow called John Graham. Grahamstown is named after him. I mean, he was a particularly nasty fellow, this John Graham. And he basically wanted a genocide, all of the natives to be killed at once. So I wrote about him and his quote unquote achievements in the, I think, Fourth Frontier War, 1811, 1812 in Grahamstown. I mean, that's like when he really just engaged in a genocide. Someone else read this piece that I'd written about John Graham, and then I met this person in Sandton. And then they told me that they are the fourth or the fifth generation from John Graham. And they are just terribly embarrassed because they never thought, because this person has always been presented in the family as a hero, but now when you see an alternative view of John Graham, and then he said, but don't you think that we should have reparations? I said, precisely, that was the point. So we've got to name the problem, so that the duty of reparations is a joint duty. It's not the duty of Black people to demand reparations from the whites. It's also the duty of white people to think seriously about reparations. And unfortunately, reparations are not going to go away. Mandela thought that they would go away, and so did Thabo Mbeki, but they won't. They are coming back. And so the sooner we channel them through the rule of law, the better for all of us.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a really comprehensive answer to all of the questions, and some that I didn't have the chance to read. But I want to turn over the microphone to Tracy. I think it's appropriate to give you a chance to respond to some of Tembeka's statements, but also there are a couple of comments or questions in the chat. One of them was from Peter to ask, what's the potential of the reasonable legislative and other measures in Section 24 to be the tool for the demos to take the action it wants to take? Or, do you think rather doing things with, for example, Section 234 would be better? And then there's a question, a long question from Mike, or a comment from Mike that I'll come to in a moment. But Melandri asked a very interesting question that's worth thinking about, I think, is how are the arguments from Earth system governance researchers, the likes of Kotze and Duncan French and so on, that environmental law is largely insufficient to address the effects of the Anthropocene featuring in this discussion. And then Mike's question, I think, is about.
Let me summarize it for you, Mel, if I may.
Sure.
I've indicated Michael's question.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
It really is saying that another look should be taken at approving mining authorizations and not to default to the social benefit that is deemed to be there, and so in social economic benefit, just because mining companies find it viable. But actually the default should be to conservation, and there should be a far larger scrutiny of whether there's actual economic benefit for the communities. If you've got a comment on that.
Okay, that's a whole lot. All right, here are my thoughts. What is the problem? Look, I completely agree that we have to make the Constitution work. The Constitution that we've got to make it work. And we must use every tool that is provided by the Constitution, public interest litigation, developing the normative content, the charter approach. But I do think that, and I don't align myself with the Constitution as betrayal position. I think the arguments against the Constitution being a Western imposition, et cetera, are often conflated. The critiques are conflated. And it clearly was an anti-colonial achievement, and it's a product of Black agency. However, that said, I do think if you look at the record of mature democracies and younger democracies in the global South, where there have been frequent amendments of the Constitution, and there is a space for starting to think about this. The Constitution is not cast in stone. Sure, we don't want to lose the rule of law, but there seems to me to be too much of a judicialization of the way our politics is resolved. That is, it feels strangulating sometimes, because we don't, even though we might have wins here and there, the real change that we need to grapple with 12 million workless class are not being put on the table. So, my position is that we're sitting on a powder keg, really. 70% of our youth are unemployed, 9% unemployed graduates. How are we going to resolve this as a polity? And we need to realize that we are in a system of self-rule. So I think it's an interesting avenue of exploration to start thinking around how we could use different kinds of democracy. I think just the question on the socioeconomic benefits. I mean, this has been a bugbear for a long time, and we really need more work on it, just to draw the linkages between Section 24 and different types of economic development, because development also has a pathway. I wrote an article in 2015, it was called The Right to Development in Environments, and it's been completely ignored. I thought it was a brilliant article, but it also talks about, the built environment being part of a kind of, it has a longevity that needs to be taken into account. It sets us on a certain pathway. So yeah, I align myself with your comments, Mike. We need more work in this area.
Thanks. I'd like to just ask one very, very quick question for each speaker, and it's really follow-up things so that we can get more. First of all, Tracy, where is your right to environment piece published, or rather right to development piece?
Right to development environment, SAJHR 2015 is something or other. I sent Mike the reference today.
Okay, and
well, if Deadly Air comes back and says Section 24 is progressively realizable, it might become more popular.
Where are you publishing the piece you presented today?
Well, it's been submitted to SLJ.
Okay, brilliant. And Tembeka, we've been asked, where's the report that you referred to? Could you just remind us? Because I didn't quite hear, and Mike has asked as well. I think that could be a very useful source for teaching and so on in the future. If you can just shout it out, the name of the report, if you're still with us. Tembeka?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, the name of the report you mentioned that sort of establishes that economic development isn't.
Oh yes, it was a report by Benchmarks Foundation. I can find it, but I've got it somewhere. I've got it, but it was published by, I don't know if Benchmarks Foundation published it, but it was an expert report in our papers in the Xolobeni case. So, but I think it's public, actually. I think if you contacted Benchmarks Foundation, they would find it.
Great.
But, you know, what I wanted to add here, there's the professor who spoke here, I think it was Peter, you know, who spoke. I wanted to add something to what he was saying, because I think what he was saying is particularly crucial, which is the scrutiny over what the mining companies present as economic benefit. I think that the applications should be rejected because mining companies do greater damage than any supposed economic benefits. Now, it's not about let's scrutinize this. It's for the country to take a position that actually we have not had any evidence of the economic benefits of mining. In fact, we've had enough damage. And so we must refuse them. You know, the idea that mining is good has been proven over and over again to be based on a falsehood. So I wouldn't even concede what he's conceding, that we need to be scrutinizing the application. That should just be rejected.
That's a powerful statement for us to end on. Controversial, but powerful. So we have one final piece of business before I hand back to Peter to thank the speakers, and that is to announce the winner of the lucky draw, who will be winning a copy of Tembeka's book, Land Matters. Coincidentally, this person has been mentioned in the discussion as working for natural justice and playing a role in the Philippi horticultural case that has advanced climate litigation and protection of farming in communities. And the winner is Puvin Mudli. And we'd like to congratulate you as a longstanding member of the ELA, doing brilliant work. And I'm sure we can arrange for Tembeka to sign the copy of the book as well for you. So congratulations. Thank you to everyone who attended, and I'll hand back to Peter, but also just with thanks to our sponsor for the event, Juta, who is sponsoring the entire conference, and then wonderfully also today, Random House, Penguin Random House, who published Land Matters. Thank you to both our sponsors.
Thank you, Mel. And to our speakers, you know, honestly, rarely, if ever, have I had an opening session to a conference that has been this stimulating and, dare I say, exhilarating. Thank you to both of you. So thought-provoking, really. You've launched us on a trajectory, and thanks so much. We're over time, so I'm going to say good night, and I hope to see all of you tomorrow.
Thank you and good night.
Good night, all.